This is the Essential Podcast from S&P Global. My name is Nathan Hunt. Recently, S&P Global published a pair of articles focused on the rise of women's sports in the US and Europe. And the news is undeniably good. This year, the Olympics will feature full gender parity for the first time ever. Women's professional sports leagues are attracting audiences and sponsorship dollars comparable to men's leagues. Media outlets are paying top dollar for the right to broadcast women's collegiate and professional sports. It's possible to look at these results and believe that gender in sports is an issue of the past. A problem, to be sure, but a problem that we overcame and moved beyond. This year, when we watch our countries compete in the Olympic Games, we will celebrate the accomplishments of men and women in equal numbers. But there is a problem with this simple, tidy, and somewhat self-congratulatory narrative. The problem of gender in sports did not end with the whalebone corset. The problem of gender in sports did not end when the Olympics allowed women to run the marathon. The problem of gender in sports continues to this day. My guest today is journalist Maggie Mertens, who is the author of a new book, Better, Faster, Farther: How Running Changed Everything We Know About Women. This is a book that breaks down tidy narratives, that talks about the history of women and running, and how the gender disparities of the past continue to be felt in the present. Let me just say, I love this book. I tore through it in a weekend, pausing only to find my wife and tell her about the latest thing I had just read. And if that sounds like I mansplained gender disparities in sports to a woman who is a former college athlete, well, that might have happened. So Maggie, let me welcome you to the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Maggie, let's start with just a basic question. Why running? Why was this the focus of this book? There's so many different stories you could have told, but you've shaped it through the lens of running. So why was running your focus?
Running ended up making the most sense as the lens for this book. After many years of research, sporting in general, and, stories about women's physical capabilities being questioned in general. So I had, as you know, because you've read it, a lot of historical examples of this happening, of women being told they were physically incapable of doing things. And I wanted to see kind of how that narrative shaped the world. Running became the perfect vehicle for that because so many of the stories that really popped out as world shaping and sport shaping had to do with running. There's the 1928 games, Olympic Games, where the women were first allowed to run track and field. And this huge incorrect narrative came out from that 800-meter race that occurred then. And that sort of ended up influencing later Olympic Games. Women weren't allowed to run farther than 100 meters for decades after that. And then there's the question of the marathon really stuck out to me as well. I think people are pretty shocked to find out that there was not an Olympic marathon for women until 1984. That's a pretty recent history, right? And it made me start to think about just the ways that our ideas as a society and about what women are physically capable of have changed so quickly. And so looking at running was a really great opportunity for that. Also because running is such a universal movement, right? I think anybody has run in their life. If you've taken a gym class, you've probably been forced to run. And I think that's just kind of a beautiful thing. And even looking at, the history of human evolution, like humans are really good at running. We're good long distance runners. And so to kind of count out half of the population from that natural movement felt pretty significant to me.
So, Maggie, a huge amount of the beliefs that historically and to an extent continue to exist around women and running concern this idea that women are physically incapable of this in some way, that women, if they run, I think you make the reference, somehow their uteruses are going to fall out, right? What were the reasons why historically men believed women were incapable of running?
Yeah, that's a complicated question for sure. I think the broad narrative was a fear of really losing the gender binary, right? Of losing the gender roles that were very instilled in our society and many other Western societies and societies around the world, which, really had to do with the nuclear family, making sure that there was a parent who was in charge of raising children and being at home, and our economy was kind of created on the back of that idea, right? And if you give women the idea that, oh, they can actually do more than that, that kind of starts to disrupt that particular lifestyle, right? That societal order. So I think a lot of it kind of rooted from this idea of a lot of fear around a changing world. At the turn of the 20th century, we had women who wanted to vote. I mean, when you just think about what a huge shift that must have felt like, to think that there was a certain class of person, a certain type of human being who was allowed to have power, who was allowed to, go out and have this freedom of movement and, deciding where their family might live or what their life might look like. And what society should look like, and women were included in that. And when they started to ask for that inclusion, that was really scary. So there was a lot of discussion around that time around kind of what makes a man and what makes a woman, and ensuring that we really have these very different ideas about the two sexes. And sports was really created to celebrate masculinity. And so when women wanted to do that, it sort of turned everything on its head. And a lot of people, I think, were just really scared of that.
Maggie, well, I was reading the book. I kept thinking of something that happened a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago, when my wife was pregnant with our first child. And we were at the time doing CrossFit. And for whatever reason, I think our gym was being renovated or something. We were in a public, gym, like a 24-hour sports type gym. And this particular workout involved interval sprints on a
Hmm.
treadmill. And my wife was doing it, and she was visibly pregnant. She was probably, I don't know, about 6 months pregnant. And she's doing these sprints, and my wife is an incredible athlete. So she's running faster than I am. 6 months pregnant, she's just going, right? And a man came out of nowhere, and he was red in the face. And he started yelling that she had to get off this treadmill. She was going to damage the baby. And my wife was like, no, I've talked to my OBGYN. This is just fine. I am doing this on doctor's advice. But I remember that red face, that fury. And I remember it just seeming so out of left field to me. But again, as you told this story about how sports has come to define masculinity, all of a sudden, his weird reaction to this made sense. But
Yeah.
it also was the fact that he was defining my wife basically as a bearer of children, and
Mhm.
that was her value, and this running was somehow self-indulgent.
Yeah, I mean, that's been another very recent shift, right? I think I cite in the book that even OBGYNs had been telling women, pregnant people, to not exercise too excessively. Even in very recent years, that was, the most common advice. Even I had my first child in 2018, and I was told similar things, right? Don't lift weights that are too heavy. Don't do anything too excessive. And I think what's really shifted that is, these professional women athletes that are just so incredible are finally getting the kinds of sports science and medical science behind them, to have these long, extensive athletic careers that include, potentially becoming parents, having children, and returning to sport. And that's given a lot of actual data to this idea that, it's actually very healthy for for a mother, for a pregnant person to continue to exercise and to have a very strong body. Because as I'm sure you know as a parent, childbirth is no joke, and and having small children is no joke, in terms of physical needs. But it's so rooted in this idea that early on, one of the first reasons given for, women cannot run, women should be kind of restrained physically from running too far or too fast, or even, exercising to the point of like sweating was a big problem, was the fear around reproductive health, and really the fact that there was very little known around reproductive health. And the men who kind of created the modern medical institutions were very kind of left that in this like mysterious corner of we don't really want to know what happens. We just want to like make sure that the babies continue to get born. And there was a lot of focus on periods being, a time when women and girls should not do anything, and puberty was like off limits. We should just like not be exercising or moving our bodies at all. Which is now we know is basically the opposite of what should be happening. But there was this huge fear that these women who were going to run, going to compete, and going to try to become elite athletes were going to become essentially masculinized, and potentially lose their ability to bear children. They weren't entirely sure how this was going to happen, right? There were rumors around whether their uteruses would fall out or whether they would stop having periods, whether, the babies would just not come when they actually wanted them, etc. But yeah, there's such a long history of that. And I think you continue to see it too. I mean, even in the political world today, right? Like reproductive health is something that's become such a sticking point, and so much of it has to do with this idea that women should not be in control of their own ideas, their own bodies, and what they should do in terms of how to stay healthy and have kids when they want to.
So, Maggie, one of the themes that you talk about several times in the book is this idea of distance, right? That there have been many points along the way where we've said, well, okay, this far, women can run, let's say, 100 meters, right? We're pretty sure at 100 meters, their uteruses won't fall out. 100 meters is fine, right? And then it was, okay, well, they can run a little farther than that, but they can't run a mile, right? And if they run a mile faster than anyone else has run a mile before, any other woman, that's not a world record. They shouldn't be running a mile. Again, uteruses. You just don't know, right? And then it was the marathon. Well, they can't run the marathon. And even if they do run the marathon, well, they didn't really run the marathon. And in the book, in this wonderful way, with this woman who is sort of the champion ultramarathoner who beats the men, right?
Mm-hmm.
But why distance? Why did that become the area of focus?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there was just any way to kind of restrict and define, an appropriate level of femininity, an appropriate level of, what women could how much women could exert themselves before it started to become troubling, right? So you do have early on examples, and this is essentially because women couldn't be stopped, right? Like they were doing some of these things. They were doing sports. Even when men said they couldn't, they would do it anyway. They would set up their own leagues, things like that. So eventually it was kind of like the men in charge of, especially like the IOC and these big international sporting delegations, they had to cave in some ways, right? So they had to at least say, okay, well, we'll give you this and you can have this, but you can't have, the full masculine slate of events. You can't run the marathon. So it was a way to kind of give women athletes a little bit without the fears that kind of came along with the rest of it, a way to continue to define difference, right? And so, you had women golfers or tennis players or swimmers who were considered, okay, this is okay, maybe because you can wear a skirt when you do it, or you can wear a swimsuit. and the short sprints were actually, it's really interesting, right? Because the 800 was considered too far because the women looked too exhausted. They didn't look basically pretty enough as they were crossing the finish line. But that's so funny to me now when you look at it, because, the 100-meter is like one of the most intense, like explosive races there is. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And of course, now we're coming to realize from a sports science perspective that women's bodies are actually better at these longer endurance races, that we have some advantages on average when you compare men and women, just in terms of being able to continue in endurance events longer, with tiring a little bit less, and things like that.
So your story about the 800 meters at the 1928 Olympics, this was one of the moments where I put down the book and I went and found my wife and I just harangued her on this story. And you will tell it better than I will. It's not the race itself, because the race went off and it happened. It was what happened on the reporting of the race that really shocks me. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little.
Yeah. A lot of the research that I did for the book, because women athletes, for all of the above reasons, haven't been covered very well, or didn't leave behind a lot of information. A lot of the research I kind of depended on was newspaper archives, and that was just a really interesting experience when I was looking at the 1928 Olympics and the 800-meter race in particular, because I kept seeing, even in contemporary reporting, because there are still differences, of course, in many sports around distance and around kind of these ideas of what women can and can't do. And I would often see sort of reported alongside these as the reason behind some of this difference was, we could trace it back to this 1928 800-meter race when all of these women collapsed afterwards. And the media, thought, and the IOC thought that, this meant that women weren't up to it. And, as I dug into that a bit and started speaking with some academics and researchers who had looked at this race, and, there were so many questions around why was this reported in this way? Because as I pulled up article after article, it's so fascinating because each one explains some terrible thing that happened, but in a very different way, right? And not even any of them agree on, how many women were even in this final when it began. Nobody reported on the fact that like 6 out of the 9 women actually broke the current world record for the 800-meter. Instead, we got, quotes about women collapsing, women convulsing, women needing medical attention, women being carried off the track, women, passing out later in the locker room even. So of course, I think as a journalist, that just starts to kind of like raise some red flags if things aren't lining up in terms of reporting. And what I also found super interesting about that was then going back a bit and looking at even the coverage of, because this was the first time women's track and field was even at the Olympics, how that idea was covered in those before the Olympics even began. And you had a lot of this kind of sense that the press was already fear-mongering around what this was going to do to our women, before it even started. So that really played into, I think, some of these reports. Of course, we don't know all of the details, but we do have photos and even some video evidence that, this race was actually pretty normal for the time. Everyone seemed upright and walking around as far as I could tell right after the race. So so lots of misinformation early on. But yeah, the press played a really important role, I think, in upholding those ideas about femininity.
Another sort of important story that you develop in more detail than I've ever read it before is sort of the history of women in the marathon, right? The marathon is full of myth anyway, right? The
Mhm.
idea of the marathon race is actually based on a myth and actually a misunderstanding of a myth. But the idea that women were incapable of running the marathon, even after they ran marathons, right? So you have these wonderful stories of women sort of hiding in the bushes as this woman hiding in the bushes as the Boston Marathon starts and jumping out and running the whole thing, and finishing, and that somehow not being evidence that a woman could run a marathon, and just how long that was fought for. And to me, the story there is really it's about the organization that runs the Boston Marathon. It's about the IOC. It is organizations refusing to confront reality.
Yeah.
What is it about organizations like the IOC that makes them unable to just acknowledge that a group of women just ran a marathon and we could do that at the Olympics? What is it? What is that conflict?
Well, so Bobby Gibb was the first woman to unofficially run the Boston Marathon. That happened in 1966. I will point out that the first woman to join the IOC did not happen until 1981. And so so we had an pretty much an entirely male sporting organization. And I think that has to do with a lot of it. Even in the 80s, we had like 75 to 80% male athletes in the Olympics. It was just a very male institution. And that progress happened so slowly, right? And again, it was one of those things of, we'll give the women this much, but we're not going to. It was often framed as taking away opportunities for men if we're going to add events for women, right? Because the charter also has this very strange thing in terms of like limiting the number of athletes that can participate in the Olympics. And so it's always kind of a give and take game. And yeah, I mean, even going into those 1984 Olympics, so they actually ended up voting the marathon in 1981. And they also did not have a 5,000-meter race yet. They did not have a 10,000-meter race yet. This was the first year that they were running the 1,500, I think. And so so that it was just a very, very slow progress. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that these men were running these sporting institutions as institutions for men. And, giving women opportunities was still seen as kind of this little consolation prize, if you will. And okay, well, maybe, I mean, we see it even today, right? Even in the past, I mean, you mentioned in your intro about, broadcast deals and things like that. And I mean, these numbers have changed drastically just in the last 3, 4 years. And so it's really, I think, an example of institutions will not change until they're forced to, right? And even in the last 5, 10 years, there have been, economists saying, there is money being left on the table here in terms of women's sports. And these institutions are too, I guess, tied to old ideas and traditional ideas about, what's important and what will make money and what people want to see. It just takes a hand being forced. And, I think the story of the women's marathon and the Olympics is so important because these women really came together and did it for themselves, right? Like they organized like crazy. Catherine Switzer and Jacqueline Hansen and all of these women who came together and started their own organizations, started their own marathons, and literally went to every member of these voting committees to sway them. Went to doctors, went to sports scientists and said, fine, we'll do these studies so that we can prove we're not, going to die or have any ill effects by running these races, even though, yes, the proof is already there. We've already been running them. But they really pushed and pushed and pushed until they could not be denied. And I think that you're seeing a similar thing happen in women's basketball and things like that, where these women are doing it for themselves, right? They're making their own social media presences be super valuable so that people can see, oh, okay, there is value in this game.
So another recurring theme throughout the book is it comes down to a definition of what is femininity, right? And the definition that keeps coming back is a very specific definition of attractive, white, preferably blonde, frail femininity becomes the only acceptable form of femininity for athletes to display. And so if an athlete is tall, if an athlete is strong, if an athlete is black, all of those things become evidence of sort of this loss of gender difference. And I am wondering, as you were certainly while I was reading the book, but as you were writing the book, and you would come across these news articles where an athlete of the quality of Mary Decker was reduced to, I don't know what to call it, the male gaze, let's call it.
Yeah.
How did you feel about that? How did you feel reading these old articles and just seeing over and over again women being objectified?
It made me angry and sad. I think a lot of the experience of athletes, especially in that era of Mary Decker, I grew up in the 90s and I, was 100% in the male gaze was the most important thing that, any girl or woman needed to know about. And our bodies were important only if they conformed to particular, standards. And thinness was just the peak of everything, right? It was it was apparently what everyone should be thinking about all of the time. And I think that's very familiar for a lot of women of just these, the late 20th century. And of course, to have that be sort of reflected back, even when talking about these athletes, is really sad because especially when you end up knowing how much pain and injury a lot of these messages were causing athletes of this era and still do. But we ended up sort of prioritizing these ideas about what an athlete should look like, what a woman athlete should look like, over what actually is healthy for a female athlete, what actually drives performance for a female athlete, and especially, runners, gymnasts, people like that. Like, I like to point out a lot that, look at the shift in how the U.S. Gymnastic team, the women's gymnastic team looked from, the 90s, 80s, and 90s when we had these tiny prepubescent girls almost entirely, to today, we have Simone Biles and Jordan Childs, who are so strong and older, right? Like they are adult women who are strong and athletic and not just prized because they are tiny and small and look this way that we think that they should look. And so I do think we're making progress on that front, but for sure, looking back on those messages and also, of course, it sort of relates to, it brings up the messages I was raised with, and some of those things that are really hard for, I think, a lot of women to shake. It was really upsetting. And then as you kind of move into even today, how women athletes are questioned, right, about their gender if they don't conform to certain physical attributes, that in and of itself is also very upsetting because it starts to make you, it does start to make you wonder how much of your own physical body and the way that you present to the world is because of you or because of what you're conforming to, right? And what you are worried about being perceived by.
So, Maggie, one of the challenges in, I think it was the second to last chapter, is a definition around what makes a woman. And this has become hugely controversial in sport.
Mhm.
There is the idea that you're only a woman if your testosterone is at a certain level. You're only a woman if you were born with that sexual identity. There is laws in the book that you reference all over the United States that ban transgender athletes from participating in women's events. There's a balance here, right? And it's a hard balance, which is, on the one hand, women have worked hard to have their own sports leagues and to create a sphere for female accomplishment. And that's amazing and awesome, right? And on the other hand, that can easily turn into something that is exclusionary to people who don't fit into tidy definitions. How do you balance those two for yourself?
Yeah. So I think the first thing for me is that I love women's sports. I think women's sports has changed my life. It just, as like a sports fan, I am so happy to have women's sports to watch. It's made me just a lot more engaged as a sports fan, a lot happier. I feel like I don't have to resign some of my ethics as much when I watch women's sports as when I, was watching more men's professional sports. And I love that. I also think, it's a very special thing. And I will die on the hill that it is just as impressive and just as elite for a woman to be performing at the top of her sport as for a man to be performing at the top of his. And I don't think women have to beat men or perform better than men on certain metrics to like be considered equals. I think they are. I think they're just as impressive, if not more. And yeah, at the same time, I do think having a sports world that is defined by a binary that doesn't really exist in sex, and certainly not in gender, is becoming more and more exclusionary. And I don't think that's okay. I think, if anything, my feeling is sports should always be inclusive. I think especially, these laws that are aimed at children, at youth sports, at school sports, the point of youth and school sports is inclusion. The point is for everyone to have the opportunity to participate. And I think the issue now is getting around the fear, right? Like we talked about the fear of women becoming manly, and we've gotten past that, right? For the most part. And I think we also need to get beyond the fear that women's sports is going to go away for some reason if we decide to be more inclusive around gender, around women who are born with sex differences, women who are born intersex, transgender women and men, I think, and non-binary individuals. Like, I think we're going to need a more expansive sporting world in the future. And I think that's okay. Like, I think that's going to be fun. And I don't think that means we have to, like, get rid of Title IX or the WNBA or, the women's college basketball tournament. Like, I think that will be more exciting, if anything, because we will have more opportunity to see these elite athletes, and maybe think more broadly and expansively around what being an athlete means, and what our physical bodies are capable of without having to constantly define it, based on sex or gender.
I think one of the things I found exciting about that chapter was that there is so much heated rhetoric on that topic and such an absence of fact. And as you dug into the medical research around the range of testosterone levels you would see in women, the actual value of testosterone for athletic performance, which is in no sense a settled issue, the performance of transgender athletes supposedly being completely unfair and they just dominate. And then you actually, in the example you shared from Connecticut, showed that sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. I was heartened to read some facts rather than opinion. It's so rare in this area. It's something that for some reason we just argue from emotion.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's because people feel very emotional around it, right? And I don't want to invalidate that. I think sports is very emotional, and women's sports in particular, especially for women who have done this work to fight so hard to be taken seriously, is very emotional. But yeah, I think when you look at the facts, it's sometimes very surprising, right? That we have all of these new rules. I mean, this Olympic Games, women who have any kind of DSD, any kind of difference in sex development in terms of being born intersex or having, particular hormonal levels that are considered too high, they are not allowed to participate in track and field, in many of these other Olympic sports, and transgender athletes are not at all. And that's really interesting when you look at, actually, transgender athletes were allowed to compete for years. They had to, meet certain definitions and be on hormone replacement therapy for a certain amount of time. But that didn't cause any kind of like overwhelming takeover when they were allowed. So it definitely feels very rooted in this, in this feeling, as opposed to the facts. And I think there was even a recent study done that came out either right after the book was published or right before, that actually showed that most transgender athletes have a disadvantage, because you are learning to use a whole new body often at, a later age. Hormone replacement therapy is not really easy or great on the body. Sometimes, that can cause a lot of changes. And if you're an elite athlete, that's something that's going to impact you pretty extensively. And so I find it really, yeah, I hope we get to a point where more people are receptive to the facts and receptive to these studies that are coming out, as opposed to kind of institutionally putting in rules that are really based on fear and mythology.
So, Maggie, I want to end on a positive note. You are a runner. You
I am.
are a fan of women's sports. When you look forward to the upcoming Olympic Games in Paris, what running events and what athletes are you most excited about watching?
Oh my goodness. Well, Sha'Carri Richardson is like my number one this Olympics. I'm so excited for her. I was so extremely bummed when she was cut from the team in 2020. And she is just so herself. And I love that. And I love that she didn't let that setback in 2020 impact her. Like, she'd been through so much, and to come back and just still be even stronger. I mean, 4 years later, she is like at just the top of the world, and I love that. I'm very excited for her. I'm a big fan of the marathon. I love to watch the marathon. I know people think it's like maybe a boring thing to watch, but actually like the Olympic marathon is pretty great because it goes quick, you know? It's like a basketball game. It's not that long because these people are running very fast. So I'm really excited about that. And I'm also excited about Nikki Hiltz. Nikki Hiltz is going to be the first non-binary athlete to participate in the Olympic Games. They're running the 10,000, and I love their story in particular because they were, running in the elite women's circuit for a long time. And once they came out as non-binary and started using, the pronouns that fit them, they have exploded as a runner and are, so much more joyful and so much more successful. And I think that's just such a beautiful story of, embracing your true self and being able to compete better too, which is really wonderful. So yeah, I'm very excited for the Olympics, very excited to have like a break from politics for a couple weeks.
Absolutely. So the book, once again, is Better, Faster, Farther: How Running Changed Everything We Know About Women. Maggie, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you, Nathan. This was really fun.
The Essential Podcast is produced by Patrick Moroney. At S&P Global, we accelerate progress in the world by providing intelligence that is essential for companies, governments, and individuals to make decisions with conviction. From the majestic heights of 55 Water Street in Manhattan, I am Nathan Hunt. Thank you for listening.